Could you please introduce yourself and give us a little bit of an overview of your personal history?
Wow. Okay. Overview. Well, I'm Grace Chaillier, and I'm teaching at Northern I'm retired now from Northern, but taught at Northern for 16 years. And fairly quickly into the process of doing that, I approached the director of the Center for Native Studies about creating a new class, and she was really open to all of us creating new classes. And she said, what's on your mind? And I said, I'd like to do a class on the history of Indian boarding schools. And she said, oh my gosh, that would be really great. Go ahead and do it. She said, I'll be really happy to see, what you come up with curriculum-wise and how you think you'd like to run the class. And so that was the beginning. And I think that was 2007, if I'm remembering correctly. So I taught that class every semester thereafter and was really happy to do that. My mother and my grandmother were both in Indian boarding schools. My mom went to two separate different boarding schools, and my grandmother was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So I have that history and background of Indian boarding schools in my family, and that was the impetus behind it all. I knew that our family was not what it could have been because of that experience. So I went ahead with the class because I wanted to learn more about the subject myself, and I also felt like it was something that's not taught at all, and it needs to be taught.
Can you tell us a little bit about where you're from, where you grew up, and what school you attended?
Well, my parents moved here to Marquette when I was 6 and my sister was 5. We came from California, but my parents basically before that had been nomads because my dad was an electrician and he wasn't in a union, and he went from big job to big job all over the United States. We lived in Ohio and North Dakota and up and down California. I was born in Chicago, and 15 months later my sister was born in Detroit, and we were both baptized in Chillicothe, Ohio. And we spent lots of time in California. I went to 3 kindergartens in 9 months in California in 3 different cities. So that's how much we moved around. When my sister was going to go into kindergarten, my mom said, we can't be yanking 2 kids in and out of schools and dropping them back into new schools, every few months. We need to really settle down someplace. So my dad called his relatives who are from Escanaba, and they said, oh yeah, come back. There's a lot of building going on and, plenty of work, and come back. So we moved back here when I was 6 and my sister was 5. And I went to St. Peter's School from 1st grade through 8th grade, which is Father Marquette School now. And then Bishop Berga Central High School, Catholic high school for 4 years. Graduated in the last year that the school was open. The school closed in 1969, and that's when I graduated. So, and after that, I kind of became a nomad myself, kind of traveled around, went to Chicago, lived in Chicago for 17 years, lived in different places. I worked in flower shops for all that time, 30 years I worked in flower shops. And then I came back to Marquette and right away went back to college at Northern, started taking classes, and before I knew it, I was in the Native Studies program, and that it was, and really I blame that all on Shirley Brazo. She was the impetus behind me getting involved in Native Studies, and she was my mentor, and I can't say enough good about Shirley. She's just been the best friend to me that anybody could ever want to have.
And then did you know what you were going to do within your career after that? Was it a given course right away?
Well, no, it wasn't. And that was a strange twist of events. Marty Reinhardt was here at the time, and he and his wife and family decided to go out to the Southwest. And so we were going to be down, a professor. And I was approached then to everybody would move up, who was below him into positions, and I would be the person that would come in at the bottom then. So when I was asked to teach classes in the Center for Native Studies because Marty left. So that was a fabulous opportunity that just dropped out of the sky for me, and I absolutely grabbed onto it, and that was the beginning of my career at Northern as a professor. And I'm ever grateful to the Creator for that.
Okay, now, what is a Native American boarding school?
Well, that's a big question. And they are schools that, in the beginning, Native children were forced into. Legally, they were legally mandated schools for American Indian children. And it was children who were full-bloods, half-bloods, quarter-bloods, any of those children could be forced into Indian boarding schools. And it was such a huge upset for families, just tore families apart to lose their children. So a lot of parents just refused. Indian parents refused. And when that happened, basically the children were kidnapped from their own families. When the authorities realized that a family wasn't going to give up their children, they would wait until they could pick those kids up somewhere when they were out playing or they were, out of doors somewhere, and they'd grab them up and they'd just take them. So the Indian parents would, didn't know where the kids were, and it was a horrible situation for so many Indian families who just were brokenhearted at the loss of their children.
Roughly, when did these schools start to become established?
Well, 1860 is a year that stands out for a couple of schools. There was school that was established, a boarding school that was established on the Yakima Indian Reservation out in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, and also the school in Berga, the orphanage school in Berga, was built by Bishop Berga in 1860. So you can imagine that we know about those two, so there were probably others, that my research has not fallen upon yet that were being built around the same time. So all of that came from President at the time, Ulysses S. Grant's peace policy. There had been Indian boarding schools before that for young children, but after the Civil War ended, they really ramped up that whole effort to get Indian children into schools. And the thought process behind it always was that it was much cheaper to educate Indians than it was to try to wipe them out, annihilate them, murder them entirely. That the process of educating them that would be cheaper than killing them all.
And the main goal being?
Assimilation. Annihilation of Indian culture, background, all of our customs and ways of being were to be wiped out. So we were basically to become dark-skinned white people. Cut their hair off and make their hairstyles whatever was common at the time, really short hair for young men, and kind of bob cuts, for young girls, and dress them in citizens' clothing, and teach them English, and Christianize them. And they will become like dark-skinned white people. That was the goal.
And was there a main demographic? Age limit? Was there more boys than girls, or was it just everybody?
Well, you would think that it would have been 6 or 7 or 8 years old, but there were often children in the schools that were as young as 4 years old. That wasn't particularly unusual for 4-year-olds to be in the boarding schools. And in the beginning, at Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Jim Thorpe was still at Carlisle when he was 22 years old. So in the beginning, the age range was completely different than it morphed and changed over time. But Indians did stay in the schools until 19, 20 years old. Wasn't unusual at all.
And who was officially in charge of these schools? I mean, was it the government or was it the church? I mean, was it an even partnership or?
Well, it wasn't an even partnership, but it was both. It was definitely both. And which I always have said is an interesting turn of events in a country that prided itself on separation of church and state. We had both the government and every denomination of church was involved. All the Protestant denominations, Catholics, schools were very common. And then some were completely run by the government. A lot of them were funded by the BIA eventually, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, had a finger in it, a hand in it. So, I mean, the Protestant denominations and the Catholics and the government were working hand in hand in these schools.
And a lot of these schools remained open a lot longer than people think. How long do these school systems last?
Yeah, so in the United States, there's lots written about that, but generally it was, people agree, scholars who study this say it was about 125 years. When you consider the beginnings of those on-reservation schools, like Yakima that I mentioned in Baraga, and then the last closure was 1986. For actually what was considered, the boarding schools that we think of as the ones that we're talking about now. Some of them didn't close at all, ever. They just changed. They morphed into other things. They were taken over by tribal entities, or they were taken over by an individual tribe itself. I guess the best example of that is Haskell Indian Nations University, which completely did a 180 from Haskell Indian Boarding School into the wonderful, culturally progressive Native American college, university that it is today.
Generally speaking, what was the quality of life like in these schools?
Well, that, I think, the overarching feeling that most of the students lived with day in and day out was loneliness. I remember asking my mom, she would tell you had a very, positive Indian boarding school experience compared to a lot of others. But I did ask her, how did you feel? And she said, I was always lonely. So I think that, most children were very lonely in those schools. And that desperate loneliness eventually became runaways. The children ran away. And some ran repeatedly. So in each time that they ran away, if they were a repeat runaway, the punishments were worse and worse every time that they returned. So when the schools were known to beat children, beatings were not uncommon at all in schools. And shaming was very common too. Boys were forced to wear girls' clothing, and children at that time were sat in corner with a dunce cap on, the big pointed cap with DUNCE in large letters, written on that cap that they had to wear. And, some of them were solitary confinement. Schools had solitary confinement areas where students were put in and only given bread and water for an arbitrary period of time and lived in solitary confinement for days or weeks sometimes, depending on the offense and depending on the administrator.
Okay, so going into the school and just more into the life of these students, First, what did they learn about? Was it like your standard curriculum, like a public school? What were they learning about in there?
Well, and that changed too over the course. I mean, 125 years is a long time for a school system. So it changed dramatically in over that 125 years. In the beginning, most of the students didn't speak English. They came from their tribal homes and they spoke their indigenous languages. So the first thing that they had to be taught was English so that they could understand what their teacher was saying, understand what the administrators were saying. And that was a difficult process in many cases. You know, they had to learn the letters, ABCs to begin with, and then learn how to, small words. And they used readers that were very, used for hundreds of years in this country. And then eventually, those people that were in the first groups went back to the reservations and they knew English, so they were speaking English on their reservations. And the people on the reservations were coming in more and more contact with citizens, American citizens, so they were learning English. So eventually English wasn't taught, didn't have to be taught as the first thing in schools. Thereafter, they'd learn civil government, they'd learn history from an Anglo-American perspective, they'd learn simple arithmetic, sometimes they'd learn geography, and in some of the schools they learned art also. There were art courses for them.
Okay, and so the students, they lived at these schools. Where would they sleep? What would they eat?
Most of the time, most of the schools had large dormitories where the students were housed, beds, fairly close together in a dormitory situation, sometimes 20, 30, 40 kids in a big dorm together on floors. And the floors were by ages. So there was, a range of age on one floor and then a range of ages on the floor above and a range of ages on the floor above that. And of course, girls and boys were separated. So the dormitories were all girls, one building, and all boys in another building.
And you went into it a little bit, but how would they be disciplined?
Well, if you can use your imagination about any way that human beings choose to discipline one another, all of that happened in the Indian boarding schools. Every way that a human being can discipline another human being happened in those boarding schools. Everything from yelling to slapping, to beatings. And some of those administrators and teachers were very, twisted and creative in the way that they chose to discipline children. There are examples in books that I've read of children who were forced to kneel on broom handles and forced to hold a Bible in each hand with their arms extended. And as soon as the arms started to fall, they were slapped from underneath with, some kind of hard implement, and just any kind of twisted, thing that you can think of that a human being would do to another human being. Kneeling on bags of beans. That was another one that I read about.
And realistically, those were daily occurrences with the students and just punishments and things happening. But say there was a day that, there was no incidences. What would a day-to-day look like? When did they get up in the morning? What would they do? When would they go to bed?
Well, it depended a little bit on, from school to school, it varied a little bit. But in my notes, I actually found one, a minute by minute. So this is Cushman Indian School in Tacoma, Washington. So they had, and remember now, this is on a military model. So all the terminologies that are used during the day would be the same that would be used if you were, in the Army. So 5:45 a.m. was reveille. And then 5:55 to 6:10 was exercise and drill. So that was like calisthenics, we would call that. And 6:12, they'd air their beds. So that was, making your bed up and airing the sheets and whatnot. 6:12 to 6:45 was what they called recreation. But sometimes those recreations were intervened by students or administrators because things needed to be spruced up, picked up, so they had extra tasks laid upon them in these recreation times. Wasn't unusual. 6:45 is the first call for breakfast. 6:55 was assembly and roll call. And then 7 o'clock was breakfast. 7:30 to 7:35 was care of teeth. And then 7:35 to 7:40 was actually either sprucing up or making those beds. Once again, just checking that everything was clean and picked up. And 7:55 was an industrial roll call. 8 o'clock was industrial work begins, and school detail at Liberty. So detail, again, is a military term, right? So 8:50 was the first school call and roll call and inspection for the first school call. 9 o'clock, school actually started. 11:30 was recall. 11:55 assembly and roll call, and 12 o'clock was dinner, what we call lunch. So this was the kind of, this goes on to the end of the night till taps when they go to bed at 9 o'clock at night, and then it starts all over again in the morning at 5:45.
Kids as young as 4.
Kids as young as 4.
So the students would be moved to the school and they'd live on the school grounds for the duration of the school year. Once the school year is over, what would happen to the students at that time?
Again, this was, dependent on the school itself and the time that you're talking about, time frame exactly. Richard Henry Pratt started a program called the Outing Program, where students went right from school to some Anglo-European person's home. Oftentimes it was farms, because Indians it was thought that Indians should be farmers. The government thought that for decades, that Indians should be farmers. So boys and girls both would go to farms, go into people's homes, and learn from the farmer, learn how to, plow the fields and everything a farmer would do. Girls went into homes and learned how to cook. They learned how to clean. They learned childcare. They learned how to, do anything that a farm wife or a white Anglo-European wife at the time needed to do at home. How to bake bread, how to cook with the implements that, that they had at the time. So
was that a program by choice? How were students chosen to be a part of that program?
From Carlisle, they weren't. It wasn't a choice. They went. And you were assigned to where you went. The children could write back to school, which they did do, and say that they didn't like where they were and they weren't being treated, fairly. And sometimes they were taken back and reassigned. Other times they were just told to tough it out. It's only a couple of months. You'll be back in school before you know it. Just the situation, it was decided upon, situation by situation individually.
But that program at Carlisle did serve as an example for many other schools.
It was a model for the other schools. All had, outing programs too. And my grandmother was a governess, went out up the East Coast and was a governess for a family. So that kind of thing also was a part of the outing program.
And then how would a student finally get out of school? Was it like a high school graduation and you got a diploma? How was that process?
That's an interesting question. That didn't happen actually very often. Carlisle is interesting to me in that regard. After being open for 10 years, Carlisle had only graduated 218 students. So not much, graduation-wise. Some students left. They had opportunities elsewhere or went to other schools. Or graduation that, and as we know it today, where students stand up with gowns on and all of that, didn't happen in the boarding schools until much later in the process. And I mean, it did begin to happen, and you saw graduating classes, sitting, but for the first, decades that the schools were in operation, graduation didn't seem to be that much of a goal, actually. It was really teach these children to speak English, teach them the basic rudimentary subjects, Christianize them, and assimilate them, into mainstream dominant culture. That was the goal.
So would they have enough education to survive in the world? Would they be able to go to college and get jobs?
No. That's an easy question to answer. No. They might have had enough education to get a rudimentary job, but almost nobody would hire them because of the thought process in this country, the discriminatory, racist feelings in this country. They just couldn't get jobs. So most of them ended up back on the reservation where they'd come from, and they had a difficult time on the reservation reintegrating themselves among their own people. They were expected to go back there and actually teach their people, what they'd learned in the schools, and Americanize, Christianize, promote what they'd learned in the schools. And oftentimes, of course, people back on the reservation, older people, were very resistant to that. So it was a difficult situation. There was a break in families there that caused, which is where we get the beginnings of substance abuse, alcoholism, drug abuse, domestic violence, because those folks that were rejected, basically, by their own people. They didn't know had lost their cultural ways, lost their language in many cases, and were living back among people that they knew when they were very small, but had lost contact with over the years and now had nothing in common with.
So their life at the boarding school a lot of the times was based around sort of a military life. Were these students going to the military ever, or was that?
Yes, a lot of students went into the military. My mom was in the military. Both my parents were in the military during World War II. Both of my parents were, World War II veterans. And going into the military became a very Indian thing to do, which when you teach Native studies and people began to understand how many of our people's 90%, if not higher, were lost in the Indian Wars and due to diseases that were brought by Anglo-Europeans. It's, non-Indian people struggle with the idea of why Indians would choose to go into the military. And Indian people say it's not about the government. It's about the land. It's about our ancestral homelands.
So let's now go a little deeper into the schools that we'll be covering for this project. How many Native American boarding schools have officially been listed in Michigan?
My understanding is that it's 5 Indian boarding schools in Michigan. So the first one there were 3 that were federally run. And the first of those is Holy Childhood of Jesus Indian School in Harbor Springs. So, and that started off in a different name, different school, was actually built as a mission school in 1829. So that was very, very early in the system of teaching Indians, non-Indian people teaching Indians. 1829 was really, really early.
That one year you had mentioned was 1860, right?
Yeah. So, at that time, at that mission school, they were being taught in Anishinaabe. The school the speakers were Anishinaabe. They were taught in their own language. So then the school morphed and changed, reopened in the 1880s as Holy Childhood of Jesus. And so that had was during a time, or just after the time, of federal Indian policy changing into this idea of assimilation. So following those assimilation mandates, they were taught at the school by nuns. The Sisters of Notre Dame taught, and they were quite harsh. Students that left that school repeatedly talk about how harsh those nuns were. They ruled that school with an iron fist, and they were quite mean to the students. Abusive. The students will tell you that they were abusive. Since some of the former students recall how they were not ever called by a name in that school. They were all given numbers. They were referred to always by their number that had been assigned to them. So that was the first one. The second one was actually, has, my understanding, a lot of different names. Baraga Chippewa Boarding and Day School in Baraga, Michigan. I've seen it also the name Holy Name of Jesus Indian Mission. And the old St. Joseph Orphanage and School. So that was built, the original school, old St. Joseph Orphanage and School, in 1860 by Frederick Baraga. And it was on a historic land complex known as the Sinans, or Little Rock, which was named after the first chief, Ojibwa chief that Baraga ever baptized in the area. So that school at its height, at its peak, had 950 students in the school. And not only Ojibwa students, but also immigrant children went to that school too. The orphanage and school was rededicated in the 1950s as a friary, which is friars, I guess, or it's like a monastery. And then eventually it became part of the Kibanabe Indian community and their tribal center in the 1960s. So the main orphanage part was torn down in the 2000s, and only a small portion of that remains. But everyone who goes by there, that area, can see still the huge shrine to Bishop Baraga that stands in, looking down over the highway that goes right underneath. Okay, so in the next third school that was federally run was Mount Pleasant Indian Industrial School in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. Interestingly, this school was not an off-reservation boarding school because it was actually on the Saginaw Chippewa Isabella Indian Reservation, which was quite a large landmass. So it was established in 1892 to educate those citizens of the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe. The complex grew to 12 buildings and was on a large section of land, 320 acres, all surrounded by grass and trees and whatnot. So that area was converted in 1934 into a home and training institute for the developmentally disabled. And then in 2018, the entire 320 acres of Mount Pleasant School was recognized as a historic district in the National Register of Historic Places. So Saginaw Chippewa Tribal Council is still talking, they have ongoing discussions about what they'll be doing with those buildings. The tribe now has control of that area, and they're talking about somehow transforming that property into a remembrance area for the children that went there, and something that will reflect the historical significance of the site. So that is ongoing. Interestingly, at Mount Pleasant, one of the students who rebelled against the school and the system that she was in was an individual called Martha Shaganabi. In 1899, she burned a building right to the ground. Started a fire, and the building burned right to the ground. The next following year, in 1900, that building was rebuilt, and a time capsule was placed in the building itself. So, that it's an interesting idea of students and their resistance too, which I, think that the students resisted in so many different ways. That was quite, amazing for a young woman like that to set that fire and burn the building down.
It's a pretty clear message.
Right, absolutely. Okay, so in the last two are the two that we know the least about. Mackinac Island, or Mackinac Mission School, it was called, in Mackinac Island, Michigan. So in 1823, a married couple, William and Amanda Ferry, started a boarding school for Métis children. And that set into motion an intense spiritual battle for the souls of Indian children on Mackinac Island. So it was also called at one point St. Anne's School. Mackinac Mission School was called St. Anne's School. And the building is still intact on the southeast side of Mackinac Island. It's a historic structure and located adjacent to Mission Point Resort. One of the earliest buildings that was constructed on Mackinac Island. So it wasn't actually in service as a school for very long. Mission School closed in 1837. So that's part of the reason why I think we don't have much in records, because everything, of course, at that time was handwritten on paper. And when you consider that 1837 it closed, those records are very, very old. And oftentimes, back in those days, there were fires. Things were lost to fire. Records didn't keep, water damage, fire. So I think that has happened with these last two. The fifth one we know the least about. Catholic Chippewa boarding school. So even less is known about it. We know that it was in UP Schoolcraft County, Upper Peninsula, Michigan, Schoolcraft County. So when it was established in the late 1880s to primarily serve L'Anse and Lac View Désert bands of Chippewa of Lake Superior, funded per pupil by both the federal government and the Catholic Church. So there, again, that's the government and church working hand in hand at one of the schools. So those are the five.
We have Lieutenant Pratt as sort of the main face for Native American boarding schools across the U.S. Is there a Michigan version of Pratt, that significant historical figure who considers themselves accomplished, or were the Michigan schools more of like a group effort?
Well, I don't think there's anybody that rises to the level of Richard Henry Pratt. But in my research, I learned about an individual whose name was Edmund Riopel. And he was the first superintendent of Mount Pleasant Indian School. So, and he became quite well known, famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, with regard to Mount Pleasant Indian School. But yeah, they were, Michigan is an interesting school situation. I have told students for years that I felt that the Anishinaabe were very savvy treaty makers, because so many of their treaties include language to educate their children. And I think not a lot of the tribes were as savvy as that, to include education time and time and time again in treaties.
Now let's move over into some of the darker content here. In these schools, as you've said, abuse at the highest level is prevalent. There are a large number of runaways, disappearances, and death. Today, thousands upon thousands of improperly buried bodies of Indigenous children are being found at these schools. I mean, that wasn't the plan originally. What was going on in these schools?
So much was going on. Students died of so many different things in the schools: abuse, beatings, but also diseases were just rampant in those dormitory situations. Tuberculosis and trachoma and just any number of childhood diseases just ran through those dormitories. And of course, we didn't know, a lot like we do nowadays about use of the same washcloths and towels. And kids are inclined to do that anyway, use whatever's at hand. Grab somebody else's towel and wipe your face with it. So some of those diseases were so contagious, that they just would go through the schools, and you read statistics about how many of those students had the same disease at the same time, and it's just mind-blowing how many of them were sick with trachoma, for example. It's really shocking to read those statistics, and sad. It's a saddening to read all that. So they died of when they ran away. Oftentimes, runaways would not consider as young children, or they were so desperate to leave when they decided to do that they didn't think about the weather, how cold it was going to be, getting the right clothing together. There's so many stories about runaways getting into trouble. And in Rapid City Indian School, I've read some stories about Rapid City Indian School. There were some boys ran away one year into the snow, and they got so frostbitten that they had to have their feet amputated. And then the next year, a different group of boys from the same school, Rapid City Indian School, ran away. They fell asleep on railroad train tracks, and an oncoming train ran them over and killed them while they laid on train tracks. So there's just so many different examples of how students, died around the school or near the school or as running away. And there aren't enough headstones, aren't enough grave sites that you can go to account for all the children that were lost at these schools. There are definitely mass graves around the schools. For example, Mount Pleasant Indian School, the statistics say that only 5 students died at Mount Pleasant, but when you talk to families, Mount Pleasant Indian, Saginaw Chippewa families, they say that over 200 children had died at the school.
Okay, so it was being washed under the rug and hidden.
Right, absolutely, yeah. Mass graves, probably mass graves. But we are finding out more about that all the time, and about those mass graves, and that will continue to happen.
So was the general public aware of these schools as this was happening, or was it just really kept under wraps?
I think there were people that knew. There were folks that were concerned about Indians, non-Indian people who were called Friends of the Indians, that paid attention to what was going on with Indian people. But I would say that the majority of white Anglo-European Americans did not really pay attention to what was going on. They weren't concerned about Indians as long as they were, being peaceful and not causing problems. They just weren't paid attention to much at all.
That kind of seems like a theme today a little bit, unfortunately.
Yes, absolutely.
And the lasting effects of these schools, they were meant to be generational. Can you talk about some of the damages these schools caused to the people themselves coming out, and then that generational memory that goes with them?
Right. Historic grief intergenerational trauma is so common among Indian boarding school survivors. The fact that these folks come away from those schools and they haven't been touched by people who cared about them while they were living in those schools from the time they're 4, 5, 6 years old. They weren't hugged. They weren't told that they were of value. They weren't told that, you can go out in the world and do wonderful things. They suffered from neglect more often than any other abuse. They suffered from neglect. And so they just had tremendous self-esteem problems. Tremendous. And then when they go back among their ancestral people, back on their reservations, and they didn't fit in anymore because they had lost so much of their Indian ways of being while they were in the schools, they, once again, it's the domestic violence and substance abuse and really taking chances with your own life because you don't really care about your life that much. Driving cars fast and car accidents and just terrible things happening. I used to read the obituaries in the Lakota Times for my reservation. While I was living here in Michigan, I was reading the Lakota Times for my reservation, and I was continually shocked about how many young people were in the obituaries. Just every week. It was shocking.
Has anyone ever been punished or held accountable for what's happened?
Well, that's an interesting question. I did more research on that than I've ever done in the past because I thought that was a good question to actually spend some time on. So I did do some research on that, and I have some names, and I think it's important to put those names out there. There was a Catholic priest by the name of Francis Suttmiller who worked at St. Paul's Indian Mission School in Marty, South Dakota. So I once talked to a student of mine who had a relative who worked at St. Paul's Indian Mission School in Marty, South Dakota. And that person, after taking my class, spoke to their relative and found out what a hellhole that school was. So that priest, Francis Suttmiller, was accused of sexually abusing an unknown number of female students at the school. While lawsuits were pending, Suttmiller died in 1996. Another individual, Samuel Motzer, a superintendent at the Fort Simcoe boarding school near White Swan, Washington, beat an unknown number of students in 1886. 2 of those students died from the blows that Motzer inflicted upon them, and no charges were ever brought against him. So this last one is one that I've known about for a long time. It was an individual by the name of Albert Roque, who was a groundskeeper at Holy Rosary Indian Mission, a boarding school on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. In the years he worked there, and he had a house on the grounds, and he raped over 100 young Lakota girls while he worked there as a groundskeeper. Finally, several of the girls got together and told their story to the nuns who were teaching at the school, and Roque disappeared. He just left the school. So he never paid any consequences for the damage that he inflicted on, we don't even know how many, Lakota girls. One of those girls was the sister of a very, very well-known Indian person who started the Native American Journalists Association. Her name was Shirley, and she always had a lot of problems. And she was a terrible mother, for one thing. And her children left home as soon as they possibly could. And their uncle, who started the Native American Journalists Association, was always trying to help his nieces and nephews, and he couldn't understand why his sister was the way she was either. And then eventually he found out that she was one of the women that had been raped by Albert Roque repeatedly. And he had a group call where all the nieces and nephews and he were all on the phone together, and he explained to his family why their mother was the way that she was. And they all cried together on the phone. So those children finally had some idea of why their life with their mother growing up had been so terrible.
So this is American history.
Yes.
Why isn't it taught in American schools?
Well, history generally, I think worldwide, not only in the United States, but everywhere, history is taught by the victors. You know, those who win the land and rule the land. It's their history that we learn in the schools. So, and that's definitely what has happened in North America, in Canada, and in the United States. The history that we learn is Anglo-European history, which is the history of the victors. And more, as time goes by, we learn more about Indian history. It's included a little bit more in all the history books as they change over time. But the Indian boarding school system has so many negatives associated with it that it doesn't reflect well on a country who tells the world that we care about human life. You know, we value human life. So in the fact that so many Indian children died and were treated so poorly and came out of those schools with such trauma that they had to live with for the rest of their lives does not reflect well on the history of this country. So it's just not taught. It's swept under the rug.
In Canada, they're called residential schools.
Yes.
Are there any big differences between these systems, or are they generally the same thing?
Well, Canada started the residential school system on the American model. Canada actually sent down a representative. You know, they were just like the United States. What are we going to do about this Indian problem? We have all these Indians, you know, and what are we going to do about the Indian problem? So eventually they sent a representative down and looked at boarding schools here in the United States and went back up into Canada and they started their own system in Canada, modeled on the system in the United States. So, yeah, they're very much the same. Those two systems were very, very similar to one another.
How has the U.S. addressed what has happened in these schools to date?
Not very well. Generally speaking, not very well. Barack Obama made an apology very quietly about the Indian boarding schools when he was president of the United States, but until very recently, until we've had Deb Haaland now as the Secretary of the Interior, and Brian Newland, who is Bay Mills tribal citizen from here in the Upper Peninsula, Michigan, in the Department of Interior, not much was done at all. Now they actually did a study. Newland released a study, and we are moving forward with hearings, and it really gives me hope, you know, that the United States of America may do something similar to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, which if you, depending on who you talk to in Canada, that was more or less successful. Indians are not a monolith. We do not all have the same opinion. So you can, talk to 6 Indians and you're going to get 6 different opinions. We're just like all human beings. We all have different opinions about how well things are going or how well, how they're not going well. So, and that's what has happened with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada with Aboriginal peoples up there, and I'm sure it would happen the same way down here.
So I do want to ask you, what do you think it'll actually take to address this, to start to fix it?
Well, a lot more organization, than what we have in place right now. That Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada would be a model to look at, to see if we couldn't do something similar to that, and then to speak to Aboriginal peoples and ask them, in Canada, what do you think should have been done differently as far as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and take those suggestions to heart and try to make a situation here in the United States that's similar to what went on up there, but even better. And I think it'll take a lot of input from Native people, and it'll also take partnerships with non-Indian people who are willing to move forward with that initiative and support it.
Why is it important for these stories to be told?
Everybody's stories are important. Absolutely every human being's story is important. The more we tell our stories, the better we know one another. The more we learn about how all of us are the same, basically, and how we all want the same things. We want our children to have better lives than we had. We want, comfort. We want to be educated. We want the same things as human beings. And the more we hear each other's stories, the more we'll be able to relate to one another, and the happier I think we'll be, all of us.